Well, welcome back, everybody. Here we are in our last keynote of our day, and this is Paul Schmitz has been working with us in Wisconsin now for how many years? Since 2016. So he's had a nice long relationship with Liz Fader and I, as well as other teams across the state working on improving behavioral health. But he is also the CEO of Leading Inside Out, Senior Advisor to the Collective Impact Forum and Initiative of FSG, and the Aspen Forum for Community Solutions. He's also an author. I have his book and essays. His book is called Everyone Leads, Building Leadership from the Community Up. And it's a very good book. I recommend it highly. He will share his insights on how we can build our capacity to be adaptive as leaders and finding places where there's common ground to work together in our communities. So thank you so much for spending time with us today. I know that it's a Friday afternoon, so we really, really appreciate it.
Excited and happy to be with you all and talk to you about what does leadership mean in these really difficult times. What I'd like to start out doing is just seeing if people in the chat, if you think about leaders you know or admire, what are some of the key qualities that you would say that leaders have, that among the ones that you know and admire most, what are some of the qualities they have? And if you could type those into the chat, I'd just love to see some of your responses to that as we get started today.
So we've got lots of them coming in.
Great. Okay, I'm on the stage chat. Perfect. Humility, empathy, kindness, understanding, personable, empathy, active listening, care for others. These are great. And some of the things we're going to talk about today. Admits mistakes, appreciate different views, resilient, energy, no ego, genuine, empathy, leads from the front, they listen, humble and integrity, authentic. These are an awesome list and really connect to what we're going to talk about in a moment. And so to get started, I want to start by, hold on. I'm going to share some slides and I want to start with a story. And in thinking about tools for both community leadership and finding common ground at divisive times, I want to first talk about community leadership and what I've learned from doing leadership development for the last 25 years. And there's a story I like to tell, and it's a story that you all know, but it's a story that I'm going to tell in a way that you might not have heard it before, that I think illustrates a notion of community leadership better than any other. It's a story of Mrs. Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott. And we have to start with Mrs. Parks. She was a lifelong rebel and radical. As a child, she got into fights when she was mistreated. She always stood up for herself. In 1932, she married a barber, Raymond Parks, because of his activism. He'd been involved in a case called the Scottsboro 9 case in Alabama, in which 9 young men had been falsely accused of rape. And he became a community organizer in the effort. And she said it was his activism she fell in love with. And he was the first, and he was radical, he was radical enough to marry. In 1943, they attended their first NAACP meeting. The NAACP up to that point had been the Association for the Professional Class of African Americans, and they were working class. Rosa was a seamstress, her husband was a barber. But her friend Johnny Carr told her that E.D. Nixon was running to be president of the local chapter. He was a porter on trains. And if elected, he'd be the first working class president of an NAACP chapter in the country. And so they went to their first meeting, and sure enough, Nixon gets elected president, but no one runs to be secretary that night. And Parks is the only woman in the audience. So at her first meeting, she gets kind of elected into becoming secretary of the NAAC. It was a position she held for the next 12 years. And it's important to pause for a moment on the fact that in this job, it was her job in this role to document all of the cases of mistreatment, discrimination, abuse, and terrorism in the community. For over a decade, she was the document repository of the community stories. Through the NAACP, she went to trainings in Georgia and Florida by the master organizer, Ella Baker, who is the national field director of the NAACP and had been building leaders throughout the South for an emerging movement. And she became an important mentor of Rosa Parks and, among other things, encouraged Rosa Parks to create a youth council in Montgomery, in which she did, in which she worked with young people from the community to stand up to segregation. Then one day she was working in her job as a seamstress for Clifford and Virginia Dewar, who were friendly to civil rights in Montgomery. And they started talking to her about her work, and they suggested that she go to the Highlander Folk School in Tennessee, where they ran trainings in nonviolent civil disobedience for diverse groups of activists from the South. And Rosa expressed interest, and so Virginia Dore raised money among her friends to sponsor Rosa Parks to go to Highlander, and actually took the bus with her to Knoxville, Tennessee to make sure she got there safely. At Highlander, she was trained by the great Septima Clark and Miles Horton, who also became important mentors in her life and began corresponding with and supporting her work in Montgomery. She said that Highlander had a profound impact on her life and that it was the first time she had lived in an interracial community where everyone was truly treated equally, and it gave her a vision of the society she wanted to live in. Then a young lawyer moved to Montgomery, Fred Gray. He was 24 years old. He was the first African-American lawyer in Montgomery, the second in the state of Alabama. And Rosa Parks took him under her wing, and every week she brought him to lunch and brought all these cases she had been documenting for a decade to see which could be turned into legal cases they could prosecute under the law. Then in February of 1955, Claudette Colvin, a 15-year-old member of Rosa Parks Youth Council, refused to move to the back of the bus in Montgomery and was arrested. Most people have never heard her name. Rosa Parks, Virginia Dore, and others thought they should use her case to challenge the segregated bus system. But the lawyers, who were all men, decided she wasn't sympathetic enough. They said she was too poor. They said she was too dark-skinned. They said she allegedly resisted arrest. She was a teen. No one was going to believe her, and they decided not to take the case. 8 months later, in October of 1955, Mary Louise Smith, an 18-year-old member of Rosa Parks Youth Council, refused to move to the back of the bus in Montgomery and was arrested. Once again, the lawyers go to the home. The fathers are drunk. They're very poor, and they decide she would not be a good case to take on the system in Montgomery, despite the fact that Rosa Parks and others are pleading her case. 6 weeks later, on Thursday night, December 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks refuses to move to the back of the bus and gets arrested. We all know that story. It was a Thursday night, but it's important to note two things. One is that in the obituaries in the major newspapers when she died, even the White House proclamation on the 100th anniversary of birth, she's often described as an accidental activist or someone who inadvertently started a movement. How accidental does she sound at this point? The second is that it's important to note it was the second time she had been removed from that bus by that bus driver for refusing to give up a seat. It was the second time she had done this, but the first time she had been arrested for it. Clifford, Virginia Dore, and Edie Nixon go to get her out of jail. They spend the next few hours at her home talking about the idea of using her case as the one to take on segregation in Montgomery. She and Raymond know they'll lose everything if they do this, and they did. They lost their jobs, they lost their home, they lost everything in it. But they make the courageous choice to go forward. So Edie Nixon calls Fred Gray and asks him if he can represent his friend Rosa in court that Monday. And then he called Joanna Robinson, who headed the Women's Political Council. The Women's Political Council was an association of African-American professional women in Montgomery. And he calls her and says, we're going to do a bus boycott on Monday. Can you get the word out? And Joanna Robinson, who's an English professor at Alabama State University, a historically black college, but a state institution, goes and overnight prints 35,000 flyers. Now, if I asked any of you to get me 35,000 flyers tomorrow on the technology we have today, you would freak out. This is 1955 technology with a hand crank. Using state paper, state ink, and state equipment in the state of Alabama, she made 35,000 flyers overnight. The women met her the next morning. They fanned every bus stop in Montgomery with flyers announcing the boycott for Monday. That afternoon, she made another 17,000 flyers so that in the afternoon rush hour, they could have a second wave of flyers going to people to tell them the boycott would be on Monday. And then, and this is absolutely true in how it happened, Edie Nixon called Reverend Ralph Abernathy at Holt Street Baptist Church and asked him if he could convene a meeting of pastors. So on Sunday from the pulpit, they would all call for the boycott. And Abernathy said, famously said, I've got a better idea. There's this young new pastor in town and no one knows him. Let's do the meeting at his church because if he gets run out of town, no one will notice. And that is literally how 26-year-old Martin Luther King got drafted into the civil rights movement. He was new to the city, had only been there a few months. He was only 26 years old. And he hosted that first meeting at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church that Friday afternoon, and all the pastors agreed to go forward. And they're all impressed by the young man. One white pastor attended that meeting, Robert Grace. His home was bombed. He lived. He just died actually in December of this year. But he happened to be Rosa Parks' pastor. That Monday, everyone marched. They walked to school, they walked to work, they walked everywhere. No one rode the buses. And that night, they had a mass meeting at First Street Baptist Church. Over 5,000 people showed up. And they asked the community to vote if they wanted to continue the boycott, and the community voted unanimously to do so. But Rufus Lewis was a rival of E.D. Nixon's. He was a college-educated business owner, the former football coach at Alabama State University who had a winning record. And he had lost several elections to Nixon to run the NAACP, and he didn't like the idea that he, a college-educated business owner, was losing to an unlearned porter on trains. And he didn't want Nixon to run this new organization they were forming for the boycott. So he hatches a plan with Joanna Robinson and others and goes before the audience that night and says, we're too divided as a community. We have too many factions. If we're going to hold together to do this, we need someone completely neutral to lead us. And as a deacon at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, with hopes of pulling strings behind the scenes, he nominates his young new pastor, Dr. Martin Luther King, to be that neutral leader, which is how King becomes head of the MIA. King then calls his father, who's the most prominent pastor in Atlanta at the time, who connected him to a pastor in Baton Rouge where there had been a bus boycott. This wasn't the first. And that pastor said, people maybe march for a week or so, but then you got to figure out how to get them everywhere. So King appointed Lewis transportation chair, and Lewis organized a 350-car carpool and a series of stops throughout the city that transported the entire community to school, church, work, and shopping for 12 months. To raise money for this, two women, Inez Ricks and Georgia Gilmore, created competing clubs of women who made and sold food every week and competed every Monday to see who brought the most money to the mass meeting, which paid for all the gas costs and all the tickets the police kept giving the drivers. Then Ella Baker took Rosa Parks on a tour of the North to raise money from NAACP donors. The Hordens and the Doers hit up the Highlander community to support the effort in Montgomery. And then Bayard Rustin came to town. E.D. Nixon was a member of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters Union, which was the largest African-American union. Its leader, A. Philip Randolph, was really dean of civil rights leadership in the first half of the 20th century. And his master organizer and strategist was Bayard Rustin. But Rustin was controversial. He had been the campus organizer for the Communist Party in the 1920s and 30s. He had then gone to India, became a follower of Gandhi, sat out World War II in jail as a pacifist and conscientious objector to violence. And he was an openly gay black man in 1955 in New York. They called him Brother Outsider. But he was a genius strategist of the movement, and Randolph sends him down to Montgomery to go support them. And he meets with Nixon, and Nixon tells him about King, and they go to King's home. And King has a man stationed on his front porch with a shotgun, a man on his roof with a shotgun, and Dr. King's carrying a sidearm. Up to that point, the marchers, as they marched through the city, carried weapons to protect themselves against the white supremacists. Rustin sits down with Nixon and King and talks about the idea of using this movement to practice a Gandhian nonviolent civil disobedience campaign. King had read Gandhi in graduate school and is quite excited by the idea. So Rustin says, first, get rid of the weapons. No more marching with guns. We have to be completely nonviolent to hold this. And he said, secondly, 85 members of the Montgomery Improvement Association have now been indicted by the local police. Can you organize them to put on their Sunday best, march down to the jail, and turn themselves in, which they did. It was the first mass civil disobedience of the movement. But they were worried that this outsider from New York was going to be found behind the scenes working in Montgomery, so he moves into a hotel room in Birmingham, where he coaches and counsels King on how to build an organization. And in fact, he and Ella Baker co-found the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and Ella Baker becomes its first executive director to create a platform for a national civil rights movement coming out of Montgomery. But Rosa Parks had been an officer in the NAACP for over a decade. And so they decided in the end that she also wouldn't be a sympathetic enough figure to win a national case on civil rights. So yet another woman who had refused to move to the back of the bus and been arrested in Montgomery, Aurelia Browder, it was her case that went up to the U.S. Supreme Court that overturned segregation in the South. So the question is, who is the leader of the Montgomery bus boycott? And I asked that question because so often we hear and read stories of heroes. And what we imagine is that leadership is about an individual hero who other people follow to create change. When the actual story of change, we can look at any major social change or innovation. What we often find, it's always a network of people leading together. And in no way does this diminish the genius of Dr. King or the immense courage of Rosa Parks to recognize that their leadership was part of a broader leadership story. In fact, when they told the story of Montgomery, they included the story of these other people. Leadership is not something that's about the individual. It's about a network, a collective, especially in this networked age we're in now. As Bridget mentioned, I wrote a book a few years ago called Everyone Leads, and it doesn't mean that everyone should be in charge at the same time. What it does mean is that leadership's a muscle. And like every muscle in our body, it only gets stronger with exercise and practice. And the important thing to recognize is every single person has this muscle. It can be built in all kinds of people. The second is that the goal of any organization or community working on change is how do we build the collective leadership muscle of an organization or community to create change? The way that we define leadership is based on three ideas. The first is to think of leadership as an action many can take, not a position few hold. When we think of the verb instead of the noun, it really opens up the possibility of who can participate and what it means. Leadership is something everyone can do. But what is leadership? Essentially, it's an active responsibility. It's stepping up and owning a result. Being able to work, to learn what you have to learn, work with who you have to work with, do what it takes to get something done. It's about owning a result. And that's why no one can really give you leadership and no one's really entitled to leadership. It's a responsibility that people have to own and be accountable for. It's the willingness to do what it takes to accomplish a result with others. But to work with others to get things done, it takes values. When you think about those leadership qualities you were listing before about authenticity and empathy and engagement and listening to others well, that's all about values. So often we mistake leadership skills and values, and we talk and overvalue in a way the idea of skills. But if you think about the best boss you ever had and the worst, or the people you love being on teams with and don't, it's not how technically smart and skilled they are in the work that makes them good bosses or bad bosses or great teammates or not. It's, do they listen to other points of view? Can they collaborate well? Do they delegate? Do they hold themselves and others to high standards? Are they ethical? Do they hold people accountable? It's all about values. And so if we can think of leadership as something that's about action people can take, a responsibility to step up and own a result that you're going to work on with others, and values that make it possible for others to work with you effectively to achieve that. That's what makes great leadership, and everyone can do that. We can all take responsibility for our contribution to some result and practice values that make it possible to work with others to do that. But I want to talk today about a few leadership practices and values that I think especially are important when we're trying to lead in these divisive times, and some approaches to think about connected very clearly to some of the messages you put in about qualities, but things that I think are going to be really helpful to think about. And those three are being asset-based in how we approach each other in our communities, to practice empathy, which a number of you mentioned in the chat, which is really an approach to thinking about, especially at a time when so many people are struggling due to the health and economic concerns in our communities and country. And finally, think about how do we use those to bridge difficult conversations that we need to have to be able to both be clear about our points of view, but also engage with others around that. And so to get started here, what I'd like to do is I'd like you to break into pairs for a few minutes. And Misty's going to put some questions in the chat. What I'd like you to do is we're going to send you to network in a moment. We're going to ask you to consider 3 questions. And you're going to interview each other with these 3 questions. So each of you will have about 5 minutes to answer, so make sure you watch the timer. But the 3 questions are, what are 2 or 3 things that make you a great family member or friend? What are 2 or 3 things that make you great at your work? And what are 2 or 3 things you love doing so much you can get lost doing it for hours? And those questions will be in the chat in just a moment. And what we're going to...
So I put the chats in the event chat so that when
They're
you're
in the event
networking, when you're in networking, you'll still be able to see them. So I'll also put them in the stage chat for our conversation when you come back. But for now, check the event chat when you go to network.
So check the event chat so that you can see the questions, interview each other in pairs. We're going to send you off for about 10 minutes. And when you come back, I'm going to tell you the really, I think, fun story about where these questions come from, and it's and why it's important to the conversation we're having today. All right, giving people just a moment to get back in. People are coming back in, I think, from the chat. I should say from the networking section. I'm just going to give you a few moments to do that. Thanks, Candy. It's good to know someone's out there. I just see me. So it's hard versus some meets where I can see that there are people out there. So about 25 years ago, a pastor was new to his church in Ohio, and his church operated a meal program, a soup kitchen. And he said he visited the soup kitchen and thought it was one of the most depressing things he had seen. And he decided to meet with the volunteers from his congregation who ran the soup kitchen and talked about how they operated it. And one of the things that happened is that they shared with him that not only did they provide people food when they came, but they would also identify other needs people had and refer them to other services and things that they might need. And they said that they had an intake process for people who came in new to ask them questions to help them identify those needs. And he looked at their intake questions and he read through them and he said, so the way you start a relationship with somebody is with these questions. And he said, so the only thing that you know about them are the answers to these questions, which were all about their needs and challenges that they face. And he said, the only things they know that you know about them are the answers to these questions. And he threw it out. And he said, we're going to start a new intake process. He said, every time someone comes here, I want them interviewed based on their gifts. And I want them introduced to the community based on those. And as they began doing that, they found that the number one skill that people had in common was cooking. So we said, they can handle that. You don't have to do that. And what he did, from what I say, is that they created a wall of fame in the cafeteria and they took Polaroids of people. If you don't know what that is, Google it for the younger folks. And they put it on the wall with a list of people's gifts. And the challenge to his congregation was no longer to feed people, but to build relationships with people based on shared gifts. And the goal is to create one community out of events too. And the reason why I like to start with this activity and start with this frame is because I think so often we get around tables to do work. And the first thing we get into is if I'm with an organization or I'm with we get into all of our labels. And when we get into our labels, we immediately find ways to divide and be different. And when we can start with questions like these, and it's great to see that people had a great conversation and had fun doing it. We often find when I do this live in rooms, it's always really energetic. These are simple questions, but they get people talking about what they're good at and what they love. And then we're starting the conversation with our assets and our gifts. And that's really the next part of what I want to talk about today. And so I'm going to bring the slides back up. And so the first, we always start with a proverbial glass or cup of coffee in my case. And the age-old question is it half empty or half full? And the correct answer is yes, it's both. And that glass is like every single one of us, everyone we work with, and everyone we serve. All of us have fullness, all the things you just shared with each other. We all have that. But we also have emptiness. We have things we don't do well, mistakes we've made, regrets we hold. What happens is often community-based work or service is often about people who've been defined by their fullness, going into communities that have been defined by their emptiness to help people who've been labeled by their emptiness with the notion our job is to fill them up with some of our fullness. We think that at best is arrogant and at worst oppressive. We think great leaders are those who, even when staring into a community or individual's emptiness, find and start with that fullness. Because that's where we can start. We all have both, every single one of us. And so anytime I'm in a relationship where I only see my fullness and I only see someone else's emptiness, I'm in trouble. Because I have to recognize that anyone I'm dealing with, even if I'm staring at that emptiness, has fullness too. And that as full as I might think I am, I've got my own emptiness. And when we have this approach, it can help us think differently of how we engage with each other, with difference, with everything else, is to understand, to have confidence in what we bring and humility about what we don't. And if you think about your closest relationships, the people you can be most vulnerable with, the people you share your challenges with, the people who know you best. My family could tell you my emptiness better than anybody around. So the reason why we can share our challenges with those people, the reason why we're close to them, is we know no matter what I shared with my best friend, I know that fundamentally he sees and values my fullness. And that makes it possible for me to have the conversation. And so often when we enter conversations where we see people get defensive or hold back or whatever, it's often because they don't trust that the other person fully sees their value and what they bring. And so just as we wouldn't share with a friendship, when we're doing service in a community or working with somebody in a community we don't know, if they don't see that we see their fullness and value that, they're not going to work with us or talk to us about the things they're struggling with, or certainly not trust us with them. And so it's really an approach that helps us think about both the relationship building, but it's also about how we see communities, because I can go into most communities and I can find all of these things at some level. And they're there. It is there. But in every community I can find this, I can also find all of these things. Every time. And in communities that most people would see as based on this, I can find those other things there too. And so both exist. The question is where you begin and how we recognize and demonstrate that we recognize that value and those assets that are there as a starting point for our work. The second thing I want to talk about is empathy. And I like to start here with the work of Brené Brown. And what I found helpful is in her book, Dare to Lead, she really gives, I'd always been looking for like a way to think about empathy beyond the idea of just getting in somebody's shoes. And she talks about it's about a connection. It's not about fixing, which is something I'm often guilty of trying to do, but it's about making a connection. It's about connecting to someone's experience and letting them know you understand their experience. It's not about trying to fix. It's not about, as she says, it's about being someone in their darkness, not racing to turn on the light so we feel better. And she talks about 5 key skills in empathy. The first is that perspective telling, putting yourselves in other shoes, being able to see the world as others see it, being able to take perspective and understand what people are seeing and how they're approaching things. The second is really being non-judgmental, is to take perspective, but not judge that perspective based on our own experience and based on our own situation, but to try and suspend our judgment, because we often judge people on the things that we feel the most shame over. The third is really understanding what are the feelings someone's expressing. Being in touch not just with the content of what they're saying, but what's the feelings behind that. The fourth is really acknowledging and communicating back that we understand and see that person's feelings. And finally, it's mindfulness. It's paying attention, listening actively, demonstrating with body language and verbal cues that we're in the conversation and not checking our phones or avoiding eye contact or the rest, but recognizing that we're present in there. We're paraphrasing back. We're letting them know they're heard. And these are skills that help us demonstrate greater empathy. There's also things that people often do that they think are empathetic but aren't, and she calls these empathy misses. The first one is expressing sympathy instead of empathy, and that's really about feeling sorry for somebody instead of connecting with their feeling. So it's the idea of someone's done something bad, poor you, versus feeling solidarity in the sense of, I see what you're feeling. Boy, I can imagine that's hard. I've been through hard things, but that's really like, it's making that connection. The second is confirming their shame. And we often do that just from like expressing awkward silence or shock or whatever. But it's the idea that what they're saying, we respond to in a way that lets them know it is really bad and they should feel ashamed about it. The third is connected, which is knocking them off the pedestal, is letting them know that we think that we're surprised that someone like them would experience that or do something like that. How could you? We make them feel like we've knocked them from some place and, again, confirm their shame. The fourth is about finding someone to blame, that if we can divert the attention from the feelings to being angry at somebody else, it'll make us feel better and feel like we can bandwagon with them. But often that doesn't really help as much. And we minimize it. We tell them it's not so bad. We're hustling to make them feel better. And so we try to just like minimize what the issue is, or we compare it. We one up their suffering. Oh, you think that's bad? So-and-so has cancer. We find some way to kind of comparatively show them that what they're feeling should be smaller, which really doesn't help someone feel better. So again, if we can think about empathy, not just as something you are or aren't, but as a skill we can practice and get better at, and we can work at trying to get better at the skills of really being present with somebody, getting inside their perspective without judgment, recognizing the feelings they're talking about, not just the content, and acknowledging to them we get it, and avoiding those misses that we often do for our own comfort. Those are ways we can get better at really making that connection with people. And again, connecting is where it starts. The second tool I want to introduce is the ladder of inference. And this is really a tool that was developed by Chris Argyris at Harvard back in the 70s, and many leadership and psychological books and authors have used since. But it really breaks down how we jump to conclusions, how intuition works. And really, what are the steps of that? How does our brain in that millisecond jump to the conclusions we jump to? And basically, the idea is that at any given point, there's a pool of observable data in front of us. But we only select some of that data. And usually there's what we call confirmation bias. We're looking for certain things. We notice things we're looking for. And so we find things that fit with that. Then we interpret that data and make assumptions about it, which allow us to draw conclusions on which we adopt beliefs in action. And here's the thing that supersizes that is, and our brain is really designed as a filtering device. We have so much input all the time that our brain is really a machine that categorizes and sorts information. And the way those categories get created, and those categories we often call mental models or filters, or what you want to call it, but they're formed, those categories are formed by our experience, by our family, our faith, our neighborhood, our community, our friends, our life experience, the books we've read and the movies we've watched and the news we watch and the social media we consume. All of that helps form in our brain categories through which, when we get information, we process it. That's what actually, when we're observing a situation, what leads us to look for certain things, to interpret it a certain way, to make assumptions. So when I was CEO of my organization, I was doing a workshop in Connecticut for a group of philanthropists, and some of whom were funders of my organization at the time. And I was doing a presentation, and early on, I'd done some activities with the group, and there was a woman who happened to be one of the largest funders in the group. And she was frowning and just looked really kind of upset. So let's start with observable data. There were about 35 people in a room. Selected data. I'm speaking and doing a workshop, and so I'm feeling stressed about what's going on. So I'm looking for people to confirm either that I'm doing okay or not. And the selected data in this case is the one woman I see frowning and stressed, not the 34 smiles, right? Like I find the one and I'm doing that. Then I interpret that. So my interpretation at this point is that she must think our work really sucks, that she must hate this workshop, that she's having this awful thing. I make an assumption that because of who she is, because I'm talking more about grassroots leadership development, and she's a very wealthy philanthropist, that this doesn't connect to her. And I draw a conclusion that I am failing with this donor and need to take action with her immediately after and figure out how we're going to build. And that, boy, I've really screwed this up, is the belief I adopt. And afterwards, I go up to her because I'm really concerned. And what happens is that she tells me that when we did an earlier activity, people told stories, and a woman told a story about being bullied. And she said when she heard that story, it made her reflect and realize that when she was in high school, she had been a bully. And then I realized that actually this workshop had been a transformative experience for her, that her frown had to do with her own processing and had nothing to do with what I'm saying. But we do this all the time. We run up our ladder on people, on situations. I say Milwaukee, or I say Spring Green, or I say, and you've got a whole set of ideas that come into your head based on your experience and mental models that tell you about what that is. If I say Milwaukee, you run up a ladder and have all sorts of perceptions of what Milwaukee is that may or may not be accurate to my experience as someone who's lived here my whole life. And the same thing might be true if you talk about your region and the way that I might perceive it. And again, we have to understand this tool, because if we can break it down, it can help us. Because the problem is that too often we start our conversations at the level of our conclusions. And that brings me to the tool of difficult conversations. So if we're going to work on really building connection at a time that's polarized, if we can walk in with that asset-based perspective and with empathy, then we can start with a notion of balancing advocacy and inquiry. What I mean by this is that you should have a point of view. I have strong points of view. I have very strong points of view. But if I can walk in with a notion that I am willing to share my point of view, but I'm also willing to inquire and be curious about someone else's. And that means recognizing that my point of view is not an absolute truth, it's a perception. And if I can walk in the conversation saying, I perceive things a certain way, that instead of coming in ready to blame somebody or see myself as all full and someone else is all empty, I can think about how have I contributed perhaps to the difference that we have, or to ways that might be causing conflict with this person. And to understand the difference between intention and impact, that often when we do something, our intention kind of gets lost in the impact. That if someone's impacted by something, they kind of don't care what we intended or not. And so often we mistake and we blend those two. But the reality is often they're different, that the way I've been impacted and what someone intended might be completely different, and vice versa. What I intended and how someone may have been impacted might be different. If I can be willing to separate those out, then I can be really ready to enter a difficult conversation. The first part is I've got to walk down that ladder. I can't start a conversation at what I've concluded. I've got to let people know that, okay, here's what I've observed. Here's how I've interpreted that. And here's the conclusions I've drawn by that. Kind of show your math. Walk up that ladder and show people what you observed and what you interpreted. I also have to be real that why this conversation might be hard for me to own if I've got an emotional stake in this, or if I feel in some way that it touches my identity, that I'm someone who's always held myself as this kind of leader. So when this has always been really important to me. But really to walk up my ladder again, in balancing advocacy and inquiry, it's okay for you to have a point of view. Of course you should. And you should share it, but be willing to investigate it. And that brings the third step, which is really listening to someone else's story. Walk up their ladder. Now, they might not have the tools, so you have to say, did you observe that situation differently? Did you interpret it differently? What conclusion did you draw? And paraphrase back and ask questions to get there. So I often work with coalitions, and I can think of a situation where someone ran to a conclusion that an organization had left a coalition because it was self-interested and uncommitted to collaborating with others and was really about their own interests. So we walked down. What did they observe? That the executive director had stopped coming to the meetings, that they had stopped returning some of their emails, and that they had applied for and gotten a grant that felt competitive with what they were doing. They had interpreted that, again, as this person had decided to leave the coalition to go their own because they didn't want to work with these people and wanted to compete with them and thought they could do it better and the rest. But when they walked up this other person's ladder, what they had observed is that they had gone to meetings and it seemed like most of the decisions were made outside the room, that there was a small group of people doing it, that he didn't have great confidence in the decisions they were making, and realized that we were rubber stamping other people's decisions, and so decided that it really wasn't a collective environment and decided to leave and not participate. And once we've walked up both ladders, then we can build a bridge story. And that bridge happens at the bottom of the ladder, not at the top. And so the question is, now we can solve the problem that on one hand, we thought they weren't coming to meetings because of self-interest, and they saw it as an issue of their interpretation was that decision made. And now we can have a conversation there and try to find a way to balance it. And the same thing can happen when we talk about social issues or anything. If we talk at the level of conclusion, if we talk at the top of our ladder, we can only have conflict. The only way to pull that down is to show how we got there. So if I'm talking about healthcare with someone, instead of saying, I support this healthcare policy or I don't, what's been your experience with healthcare? What's an experience you've had where it's worked really well for you and an experience where it hasn't? Have you had a situation where you got bills you didn't understand? Walk up with somebody. Have the conversation at the root, because that's where we can build that connection. And too often what we do is we come into conversations around issues in our community or policy issues, whatever, and we start with labels and we start with at the top of that ladder. And if we can pull it back and start to have conversations about what we observe and interpret and experience in our own lives, that's where we can start to build those bridges and make those connections. And again, to do that, I have to walk in bringing both confidence in my fullness and humility about my emptiness, with empathy toward the other person, and an ability to really walk through a conversation with inquiry and a desire to really have curiosity about the other person's perspective and to walk up. It doesn't mean necessarily that we'll come to agreement, but it means we can have a different kind of conversation than we often have, and have a conversation that has a potential to bridge us. And so, again, if we think of those tools, and we think about tools that can help us think about ourselves and others as assets and build relationships based on gifts and get to know people, not based on positions or views or roles, but on what they're good at, and get to know people's gifts. If we can then bring empathy into the conversation and really try to get inside, be willing to get inside someone's perspective and listen. And if we can use that ladder as a way to enter a conversation to think, how can I kind of share this story coming up from the bottom of that story of what we've observed and interpreted, and find out how someone else did that, and then find that connection. That's something that can really help us to begin that. And so what I'd like to do is have you do one more networking conversation. And what I'd like you to do with your partner this time is answer the question, who is someone you could seek to have a bridging conversation with? And so you'll have a chance to go back to the networking tab. The question is in the chat. It'll also be, I think, in the event. And we'd like you to spend just, again, 10 minutes with a partner and think about, is there someone you could bring, if you could bring yourself half empty and half full with empathy into a conversation, and use that tool of really thinking about how do we separate out not just what I've concluded, but walk through that and walk through their perspective. Could we start to build a bridging conversation with someone that we've struggled with? And so we'll invite you to go away for 10 minutes, and then we'll come back, and we'll have a little bit of time if there's any questions that people have. But thank you so much, and we'll see you in 10 minutes. All right, welcome back, everybody. And again, thank you all for coming back. Let us know in the chat that some of you are back, because we can't tell from the process. Great, Danielle, thank you. Love when people help us out here in the backstage area. So thanks to the rest of you. So again, just to close out today, I think that if we can enter our work recognizing every single one of us has the ability and responsibility to lead, and that we can take action on the things we care about, and that part of that leadership is also finding that space where we can make connection to others, to practice empathy as a leadership practice, because when people know that we connect with them, they're willing to work with us on those things we want to contribute to. And if we can recognize a part of leadership is also being able to work with people through difficult situations and have difficult conversations. And again, just today we shared with you a simple tool that we can use to kind of structure and think about that. I've shared my slides with Bridget and asked her to share them with all of you. It also has the book references that the difficult conversations and the empathy piece come from, and some of the other things. So, but thank you all for participating today. And again, I think in these times we all want to create space for people to lead. If people have any questions, feel free to drop them into the chat space, and I'd be happy to take a few questions. And then I'm going to welcome Heidi to kind of take us through the thought exchange. And so we'll give it just a moment here to see if any questions come up that I could help with before we jump into that. So why don't we jump into that, Heidi, and
you got it.
Engage with people.
Yes.
Thank you.
Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. So welcome back, everybody. I sure did enjoy the presentation, Paul. Thank you so much. I was telling Paul during the break, I took copious notes. So can't wait to get that PDF. So based on the presentation and maybe even the entire day's events today, what a wonderful day of learning it was. Our next thought exchange is, what could you do more of to contribute to a healthier community dialogue? So for those of you who participated before, you know exactly what you need to do. Hover over the QR code with your iPhone or your QR scanner on your Android, or you can join by typing in tejoin.com in your browser and typing in the code, or I believe Missy's going to put the link in the chat should you want to participate on your device that you're watching today's virtual event on. If you could do it on your phone, that'd be better. I'm going to go ahead and put the timer on. So share your thought of what you could do more of to contribute. And remember, once you share a thought, you can always go back and share another thought. There's no limit to how many thoughts you can share. Once you share your thought, tap the star button and then start rating the thoughts of others with regard to how you resonate with that particular thought. Do you agree with it? Do you not agree with it? All thoughts are important, but we're crowdsourcing today. And what we're doing is we're seeing what resonates with this group. And I didn't get to mention before, but if anybody is interested in Thought Exchange, we are offering a free trial right now during the pandemic. We don't usually do that, but we are, from the goodness of our heart. So please feel free to contact me. Just forgot to mention that earlier. Basically, you're able to gain unbiased critical insights. And if you're a leader, it really, really works well to help you make decisions, kind of speaking to what Paul just mentioned: empathy, perceptions, perspectives. So I'll just let you participate and we'll just have some silence right now. Right. Fantastic. Whoops, I hear somebody's alarm. So, Paul, this is going to be an opportunity for you to maybe have a little interactive time with the group. Maybe they didn't have questions, but maybe this is kind of what they were looking forward to, sharing with you what they learned today. And this top thought stayed up there for quite a while. I didn't really see it move much. You want to go ahead and read it, Paul?
Sure. So listen to hear rather than listen to respond, which is great. That's really absolutely an important piece of this. The other, other thoughts that you've got here. Yeah, listening without the urge to respond. A lot about listening here.
Yeah. Here you go. Oh, there's another one. Be open to different perspectives than my own, right? I took that note down too from your presentation. How about this one right here, Paul?
Yeah, lead and follow with vulnerability and empathy is, I think that, you know, there's, I think one of the great things that Brene Brown in her work talks about is just that vulnerability is a form of courage. And that often we think of courage the wrong way. And it's that ability, again, to make ourselves connected to others and open to each other, that we can do that.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, in my work, I work with a lot of leaders of organizations, and some of them do struggle with the vulnerability piece of the thought exchange. Sometimes they'll use a thought exchange and ask their staff, how can I be a better leader? And some of them are open and some are not. And it's a growth piece. It really is courageous. Is there any others that you see here?
Helping leadership set the tone of the values they espouse. Absolutely. I think we have to practice what we preach as leaders and model that. Again, if we're trying to create a way for people to come together, we have to model that. And modeling it and striving to do it doesn't mean you do it perfectly. And so it's important to do that. Helping leadership set the tone of values. And I like that point about, you know, you can't really, I find with most groups, one activities I love to do with a group when I'm forming a team or group is we do an activity where we first make a list of, if we were trying to make the worst team or collaborative possible, what would we put in place to make sure it really sucked? And we make a list of all those things. And then we ask ourselves, what can we put in place in this team to prevent that list of things from happening? And it's an activity I like to use to start establishing ground rules and values for a group. And again, I think if the group all agrees, these are the ways we want to work so we don't have the bad experience we've had in the past, that can be a way to form that kind of common ground that we can work together on.
Oh, I love that. So let's see, anything else here that resonates that you could maybe elaborate on?
Empathy is great. Again, a lot of connected ideas, and, you know, remembering it's not about me, and that it's not, you know, the moment our ego is tied to winning instead of to understanding, we're going to be in trouble. And again, to be less judgmental, to be more accepting, and the rest. And there were a couple questions. You know, Roger asked, what if someone is not meeting you equally for the talk? And I have to say, with this tool, it's not like this is the perfect tool. It's going to work with every relationship we have on the planet. You know, we do have to be entering with somebody that we think we can have that kind of conversation with. And if someone is absolutely entering with an unwillingness, or we just is toxic, or may have other challenges to be able to do that, we're probably not going to be able to have that kind of conversation. We do, but I found that most people are able to have these kinds of conversations, and it's a smaller number who absolutely can't. But it is absolutely true that there are people, and I've certainly dealt with people who just like, there's no way they're coming out of their position. There's no way they're going to change or be open to another view or anything. And I kind of don't have to deal with them. And if I have to deal with that person, I'm going to have to figure a way through. But in some cases, I decide I'm just not going to address that. And so, but in most cases, I find we can get there. Chris asked, appreciate the framework, and asked, how do you have difficult if the other person isn't interested? And again, I think it's the same answer as Roger's. It's not always the case that you can get there, but I think that if you can find, I found that most people and in most situations you can go there. And again, if you enter with that space and that thoughtfulness and intention, it usually disarms the other person coming in, because you're entering in a space that's like not coming in ready for a fight, but coming in ready to understand. And I think when we enter in that way, we have an opportunity. Not everyone takes us up on it. and not everyone behaves well within it, but we can make the attempt. And again, then we know we've tried and we've tried our best and we've made our attempt. And if it doesn't work, it doesn't. But if it does, we can start to create that opportunity. Julie says, sometimes I think this context, maybe the winning mentality equals saving people. When people need less saving, then they need speed, then they need to be seen and heard. And I think that's true too. I think a lot of people just want to be heard and understood. And I think we create that space to listen and understand, maybe their desire to win becomes less critical. Thanks, Julie.
Paul, are you able to see my screen again with the word?
Yeah, no, the word map. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So I wanted to show this because this word cloud is representation of this group and what they're going to do. And the word, the top words, if you look at the top themes here, respond. You can look at each thought.
Yeah.
And so you can see the top. Empathy was most definitely right. And I love that conversations was in here. Having those uncomfortable conversations. Mm-hmm. So you can see that people were very receptive to your presentation today.
Great.
So these were the words.
All wonderful things. I'm happy to see people connected with a lot of the ideas. And again, I think that that's a great word cloud for any group to have. And, you know, again, I think the idea in leadership is we can be part of we can work to make the problem bigger or the solution bigger. And I think these are tools that can help us try to make the solution bigger. It doesn't mean we're going to have the solution or be the solver, but it means we can try as leaders to contribute to the solution. And that's something we can try to do with these tools in a way that might be helpful versus walking in just trying to like hold the problem. So thank you, everyone. It's great to be with all of you. And thank you to Bridget and Heather and I'm sorry, Bridget and Hannah and Liz and my old friend Robin, who all worked with you out there. And thank you to Heidi and Missy for putting this together. And again, great to be with everybody and have this time with you. I wish it was in person, and someday we will be, hopefully. Thanks again.
Thank you very much, Paul.
Yes. Cheers.
Have a good weekend.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.